Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and we're back on the couch. A conference that took over a building.
Yep.
They're out, and we have our space.
Trying to put it all back in order.
We kicked them out. We're like, listen, the green couch has to be here. Oh, John, a loyal listener of the show, came up to me on Sunday. He was
green
like,
couch.
Hey, when that couch is replaced, I'm still going to call you the green couch people.
Oh, all right.
we will still be the green couch people.
If you're an audio listener, you have no clue what we're talking about, but this podcast.
We have a green couch.
Yeah, we have a green couch.
If we replace this green couch, I think we'll have to replace it with another green couch.
Another
That's
green
true.
couch.
We could do that. Yeah.
Caroline's shaking her head. She's like, no.
We don't. Yeah.
Back last week, we started kind of a series here in the podcast and with our Sunday morning and our worship services here called Let's Talk About It.
Let's talk about
And
it.
we're talking about these kind of bigger topics that we are all talking about at our dinner tables and families and friend groups and online and all the stuff. Week 1 was on politics, easy subject, which there's a message with that. Then there's a podcast where we answered a lot of your questions last week that were submitted in. And then this week was on mental health. And so thank you for people who submitted in questions on mental health for us to answer today.
Great message from Craig. If you didn't get a chance, go back and listen to that. Because, Craig Pierce from our preaching team did such a great job of addressing a really big topic in a short period of time, but in a way that actually I think really names some things that are really helpful for us. So, yeah.
You can watch any of the messages from this series or past series on our YouTube channel, or you can go to Spotify and search our church's name, and you can have the sermons and stuff there. But today's on mental health. And let's just start here with the question that was submitted. I don't know why I carried that out there. This question was submitted by someone in service on Sunday. What about people who have done everything spiritually they know to do, but are still suffering greatly, sometimes for years?
Yeah.
I mean, I think maybe I'd want to begin by saying, I'm so sorry for if this is, if the person who submitted the question, if this is you or maybe a friend, like, I'm just so sorry that that's your situation and for the pain that you have experienced. I can't imagine what that's like. And then I think just to caveat comments that we're providing is we're talking from more a pastoral care counseling perspective, not from we're not trained professionals by any means. And so I just want to be careful with that. And then also to say, I don't know the specific details around when we think about this question, everything going on. So really speaking broadly, I'd say, first of all, when you talk about I've done everything spiritually, the first thought I had was with mental health, it's such a complex, multifaceted issue that there are biological, psychological, spiritual components, aspects to that. And so when I think about that, I would just be mindful to remember that God has given us other gifts in terms of trained medical professionals and counselors and medication. And these are all forms of help and so when you think about just like I've done everything spiritually, there are still other forms of help. And sometimes we think about it, we separate spiritual from emotional. And so there's just other forms of help that are, I think, part of God's grace to the world and to us. And so that's one thing. And then secondly, what came to my mind was when we look throughout Scripture, we see that there are men and women who had deep faith, deep trust in God, and yet experienced profound suffering. And, often when we think about suffering, that one person we think of is Job. And Job experienced physical and psychological, emotional suffering. And God didn't actually just immediately rescue him from that. And Job asked God, why? Why is this happening to me? How can you do this to me, God? And God never actually even answers his question. And yet we see that Job experiences God's presence in the midst of his suffering. We look at Paul's life, and Paul 3 times, asked God to remove this thorn in the flesh, which we don't know exactly what that is, whether that was a physical ailment or maybe it was something emotional. But God responds by saying, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. That oftentimes, God doesn't just take us out of the suffering. He takes us through the suffering so that we might learn to rely on his strength to endure whatever the circumstance is. And I'm often reminded, because I need to be reminded, that God didn't promise me a pain-free life. I really, a lot of times, want to live a comfortable life. And I don't think that's always the case. And I don't think that's God's goal. As we look at Scripture, God's agenda, God's desire for our lives is that we would be conformed to the image of Jesus. And often God uses even the bad things in our lives, and we've talked about this before, right, to bring about good, because his desire, his agenda for our lives is that we would be more like his son. And sometimes that happens through the crucible of suffering. So those are a couple things I'd say.
So good. Yeah, I think that to begin from that place of empathy is so important. I hear the question and it just it touches my heart, right? Because this is coming from a place of struggle, a place of pain. And so I think there is something to, so I sometimes use this little statement that I worry then gets misheard. The statement that I use is, we believe that the deepest solutions to the deepest human problems are found in discipleship to Jesus. And what that can maybe sound like is discipleship to Jesus solves all our problems, right? And that's not true. And that's not what I'm intending to convey with that statement. It's also not even that the idea that the only solutions to the deepest human problems are found in following Jesus. Sometimes I think following Jesus means following him right into the therapist's office, right? That we actually, that's part of what we need is our faithful discipleship to Jesus is actually, I need somebody who's able to help take me to a deeper place of emotional, psychological exploration so as to experience a deeper emotional, psychological healing than perhaps I ever had before. And that is in the context of discipleship to Jesus, but it's that idea of I need Jesus and a therapist too. But it's also recognizing that merely having a therapist without following Jesus, there's something deficient in that, right? So we want to be careful also never to engage in what's called spiritual bypassing, and that is this idea that I can just do the spiritual things and avoid that deeper emotional work, that deeper psychological work. And well, this is all part of God's plan, or, we reach for almost too quickly sometimes those God works everything together for good for those who love and are called according to his. And we can use that in ways that actually prevent us almost as a shield to hide from the deeper level emotional work, the deeper level psychological work that we might really need to do to really unearth what's going on in our lives and to really experience healing in a deeper kind of way. So yes, we do believe that the deepest solutions to the deepest human problems are found in discipleship to Jesus. But sometimes that means following Jesus into a therapist office. Yeah. I love what you said, though, is just that recognition that we are not promised shalom now, right? Shalom on demand. That God's going to fix everything right here and right now. I think what we are promised is that he will meet us in the middle of whatever it is that we're going through, that we may walk through seasons of pain, seasons of suffering. And we're not promised that he's just going to deliver us from that. But I believe we are promised he's going to meet us in the middle of it.
Yeah. And what I would add to that, we're not promised shalom now, but there will be a day when that will come. Right. And so oftentimes what's helpful to me in the midst of suffering is to take that step back and look at the bigger picture. And the biblical idea of hope is like that our present sufferings isn't the end of the story. That there will be this day where there's no more death, no more crying, no more mourning, no more sadness, no more pain. That day is coming. And God, that King Jesus will rule and reign, and he will redeem the world, but that also includes us as well, And so that's such a hope for me to know
healing will come. Deliverance will come. Yeah. Redemption will come. Restoration will come. And then that idea that, shalom will come now we can pursue the glimpses of it here and now.
Yes.
And we can experience those glimpses here and now. Sometimes even in the midst of the pain, we get a glimpse of shalom. And it's that reminder, right? That foretaste of what we know is coming that sustains us even through the hard time.
Yeah, it's good.
Why do you think that the church has struggled at times to talk about the subject?
I think that's such a great question, because I think that is really true. And I think, and it's not just the church, but I think there's such a stigma, or has been over the years, with mental health. And the church maybe in particular, it's been associated with some kind of spiritual weakness or lack of faith, that if you're a follower of Jesus, well, I mean, you just need to trust God more. And shouldn't we be people of joy and peace? And if that's the case, then why would you struggle with a mental health issue? And I just think that's so not the way of Jesus. That's not what the scriptures tell us. And oftentimes that can lead to shame, and people that are struggling with mental health issues to then fear judgment from the church and not get the help that they need. That, as you said, these are follow Jesus into the therapist's office. Like this is part of how God wants to use healing in our lives. And so I think that's part of it. It's just the way we've sometimes maybe over spiritualized is a good way to say it, things like that. And then I think we also don't recognize, or haven't done a good job of being aware of, particularly conditions, mental health conditions like anxiety or depression are medical conditions and do require medication. And so if you or I had a physical health issue, we wouldn't think twice about getting a prescription or going to the doctor. That would be like, that's obviously the right thing to do. And so why do we think about mental health differently? You know?
Yeah, I think that there's been a tendency in the church to just dramatically oversimplify the reality of the human condition, right? And really the devastating effects of sin in the world, right? That we tend to have this conception of sin that really is just about the things I do wrong that make God mad, right? And fail to recognize all the ways in which we experience a profound sense of alienation as a result of sin that has to do with alienation from God, from each other, and even a sense of alienation from myself, right? And so I think part of it is this idea that the church oversimplifies the reality of the human condition, and therefore then tends to oversimplify the solutions to our human problems, right? And that then is part of what leads to, well, gosh, if I'm not living the victorious Christian life, if I'm not filled with happiness and joy all the time, something must be wrong with me. And then the tendency from there is either to say, therefore, I don't want to have anything to do with that, or I'll just show up and fake it.
Yeah.
And I think I've experienced church environments where that's kind of the expectation is, if you're not doing okay, you can't actually say that. You just have to sort of pretend that you're doing okay. And so we want to try to cultivate an environment where we can all be real and honest about the reality of where we are, that we don't oversimplify the reality of human condition and therefore oversimplify the solution to our problems. I think the other thing is that idea of just the way in which mental health issues have a certain kind of stigma about them. You mentioned medication, and I think we're even talking about, a question around that. And I think specifically about my blood pressure, right? I take medication for blood pressure, and there's a certain aspect of my high blood pressure that is genetic, that both of my parents and all four of my grandparents had high blood pressure. It was a certain sense inevitable. It's in my genes.
Yeah.
And then there are factors in my life, my lifestyle, the things that I can affect my blood pressure. And so both of these are true, that there are certain aspects of it that are completely outside of my control and really have to do with my genes and my body and its functioning. And then there are things that I have the ability to affect by the choices that I make. And mental health is, at the end of the day, health, right? And that there are things that are outside of our control that have to do with chemicals and genes and all of that. And then there are things that we have some ability to have effect on by the choices that we make. And yet we do end up creating such this stigma, is that I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't struggle this way. And therefore, I think that's where sometimes for Christians, that sense of like, well, I shouldn't take medication for this is associated with that. And that to me is as, quite frankly, ridiculous as saying I shouldn't take blood pressure medication, right? Yeah. And this is where, I think we'll even get into some more of the ways in which some of these topics actually overlap with each other. We'll talk this coming week about technology, and this is the human ingenuity to create the kinds of things that we have created. The fact that humans have been able to develop medications that help us with some of these mental, emotional, psychological issues, that's pretty remarkable.
Right.
And that, I believe, is a gift from God that comes from the ingenuity of his image bearers that have created something that can really help with some of these. And so I think we need to get over some of the stigma that's been associated.
Yeah. And I love what you said, that it's both, right? There are things that we have some control over. And if you think about a physical issue, and there are things that we don't. Yeah. And we have to think appropriately about when is it appropriate to use that medication. Because I do think, and this is just generally in the United States, my opinion, that we immediately go to, and doctors immediately prescribe medication for just about anything, when sometimes we do have a little bit of control over. I think about my own health of like, well, if I just change my diet, then maybe I could do something. Now, that might not be the case. I might actually need to take that medication. But
I eat less peeps than
I eat like 1 peep a year.
It always comes
back to peeps. And this is from someone that's just like binging on candy corn.
I do like candy corn. It's the season.
It's the season.
Okay, we did have a question about antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication. I feel like we covered it pretty good there, unless y'all have anything else.
Yeah, I mean, no. I think it's... I think we have covered it. I think we need to get over the sort of stigma associated with it. Sometimes I think in Christian circles, people can think, well, the answer is sanctification, right? Yes. You'll grow in holiness. You won't struggle in these ways, and therefore you won't take these medications. And I kind of want to come back and say, maybe that actually getting on some helpful medications is the best thing that you could do for your own sanctification, right? Like you can actually grow in holiness. On the other side of getting some help that comes from some of the things that are available to us.
Yes. Read your Bible more, pray more, trust God more. We should all be doing those things. And also this could be helpful to you.
Yeah. And this kind of goes with this question, like, can you be okay spiritually, but not mentally? Like, cause I feel like growing up for me, I heard so much of just like, oh, if you're off mentally, then what do you need to do to get closer to Jesus right now? It's like, man, somebody can be pretty good spiritually right now, but also struggle.
Yeah. So Pete Scazzaro, who's written a lot around this whole idea of emotionally healthy spirituality, makes the claim that you can't be spiritually mature and emotionally immature. And I think there's something to that, but it's different than the question as asked, right? He's talking about specifically around maturity, and being emotionally immature means you really haven't done the kind of work that you need to do to get in touch with your emotional life and to grow into an emotionally mature person. And he would see that as a spiritual deficiency, right? You haven't arrived at spiritual maturity because you haven't done the emotional work. But the question as asked actually is getting at something else. And that is just this general sense of okay, and particularly okay, mentally. And the fact of the matter is that there are some times in which we are experiencing distress. We can be in a healthy relationship with God, walking in dependence on him, walking in holiness, and yet experiencing distress. I think of somebody like Charles Spurgeon, who's the famous preacher who loved God and was doing incredible work in ministry, and God was using him in profound ways, and yet he struggled deeply with depression. And this was something that was part of his thorn in the flesh that he carried, that he dealt with. And so, I think we have to get beyond the idea of like, if you are just walking closely with God, if you are just reading your Bible, praying, right, you're walking in holiness, then all of this stuff just is going to kind of take care of itself. And I think that's a unfortunate misconception.
Yeah, I think that's so well said, that we need to be careful that we don't think about mental health issues as simply lack of faith or, there must be some sin in your life, right? It's like the story of the blind man. And in John 9, why is this man born blind? And, Jesus responds, this is so that the work of God might be seen in his life. And so I think we need to be careful that is an immediate sign that someone is not trusting the Lord enough or not walking by faith. At the very same time, then this is a little bit of what Scazzero talks about is I think we also need to remember that we are integrated beings. Yes. And I think so often we separate the mind, soul, and body from one another. And I don't think we could do that we are integrated in this way. And so they do in some ways go hand in hand. And yet I think we need to be very careful to say just because you're struggling with mental health issues doesn't mean that you don't love God enough.
Yeah. And so I think, and there's sort of a both and to it, or there is the reality that we have to get over that misconception that if I just love God more, if I just prayed more, if I just read my Bible more, if I just, sin less, then all this stuff is going to take care of itself. The flip side is there are some times in which the lack of those things or particular patterns of sin actually do exacerbate struggles with mental health. That when we are walking in persistent patterns of sin, of rebellion against God, of things that not only hurt God's heart but hurt our lives, and because again, sometimes we think of sin merely as what makes God mad. Yeah, and I think we need a richer notion of what sin really is, and the way in which it grieves God's heart. And in part, it grieves God's heart because it harms us. It alienates us from him, from each other, and it alienates us from ourselves. And so just the recognition, it's not merely sinning less that solves all my mental, emotional problems, but walking in persistent patterns of sin actually can make my mental and emotional struggles even worse. It can exacerbate the problem as it adds shame upon shame. Yeah.
We had this question submitted in, said, what advice can you give to those who are trying to love well a family member who is a narcissist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am by no means an expert on narcissism, but I have, I remember meeting with someone who had a very similar issue. And the two things I told them, I think that hopefully was helpful to them was one, I think this is such an instance where talking with a counselor is really helpful because processing that relationship and what's going on with someone who has that kind of expertise can really be helpful because it's so complicated. And so thinking through strategies about how do you actually handle that relationship well? How do you care for yourself? How do you care for the other person? And so thinking through that, and then how do you love with wisdom? Because I do think we're called to love, and yet I think we have to be wise, especially narcissism often comes from deep insecurities and wounds. And when you're dealing with someone like that, you have to be really careful to love in such a way that it doesn't enable bad behavior, right? And you're not enabling that. Rather, you have defined boundaries, and you can do that in a way where you're still showing empathy and compassion to them.
That's exactly what I was thinking of is what does it look like to have both compassion and boundaries? Yeah. Right. That when it comes to this question, and again, the first thing is I was even jotting down some notes, just thinking about acknowledging the complexity of it. Yeah. Right? That there are no just simple 1, 2, 3 solutions. We have to acknowledge the complexity of the situation, to lead with compassion, because this is who Jesus is and is teaching us to become. But compassion doesn't mean that we don't have boundaries. Right. And boundaries are actually a form of love. They're a form of love, for the other that is not enabling their bad behavior. And they're a form of a certain appropriate kind of self-love, right? That we're actually caring for ourselves. And so the importance of self-care for someone who is trying to love a family member, a loved one that is a narcissist, of making sure that you're establishing boundaries and you're practicing self-care, I think are a couple of really important things. I thought about just the idea of the importance of having community. I love, your admonition to say sometimes having a professional who's able to help you understand and have some strategies that has a maybe even deeper level of insight into this. having compassion for somebody who's profoundly self-consumed can actually be really hard. But a professional can help us understand more deeply. Here's what's going on underneath that. Yep. And the more we're able to understand what's going on underneath that for the other person, the more we're able to have compassion while still figuring out, okay, but what does it mean for me to have healthy boundaries in this relationship?
Yeah, good.
I was going to say, there's a lot of amazing resources out there too. I would say outside of the church and sports, this is like my number one passion, just because of my past history with this and living through this, and just finished another book on it. I've read multiple books on it, and I'll just say, if this is you and you're willing, reach out to me, look on our website and reach out to me, shoot me an email, and I can shoot you some resources that I've found really helpful, because I think you feel like you're in an impossible spot sometimes, and trying to, when you read different things or resources or talk with a therapist, you feel seen and you're like, hey, somebody else does get it. Because I think this is one of those words that's thrown out so much in today's world of, they're narcissistic. You know, it's almost just, it's so like lightly thrown out that NPD, like it is a personality disorder when you start going to the extremes of that, and can get really dangerous. So, anyway.
I'd also just say, and you have said this in different ways, but this is an opportunity to think about what's yours to steward and what's yours to surrender, because oftentimes in instances like this, we want that person to change, and we can only control our actions and our attitude. And so just what's mine to own? And then what do I have to just give to the Lord?
All right. At the end of each episode, we try to have some banter.
Oh, boy.
And we have some fun with it. So these final few minutes here, I got a question for us.
Oh, boy.
It is, in the spirit of election season, that's just a lot of fun, you know. In a lighthearted, fun way, what is one single issue that if a candidate was like, hey, I'm going to do this, you're like, you got my vote. I'll go first to give you like an example. So if a candidate came out and was like, I'm going to ban onions, I would be like,
ban onions. You got my vote.
Yeah, I'm in line already. Like,
awesome.
I don't even know what to say about that. Like,
there's nothing good about onions.
Oh no, you're missing out on so much of
no, there's nothing good about onions.
The beauty and glory of God's creation.
I cook with so much different stuff, like spices. Whenever I cook at home, onions nowhere to be found.
Unbelievable.
It smells horrible, makes you cry, makes your breath absolutely horrible. I don't want to stand anywhere close to somebody who's eating onions.
There's so many different preparations of onions.
Well, you don't eat
hours.
An onion like you take a bite out of an apple. Like, that's not what you do.
No,
but you can cook
any of it though. It's just horrible. Like it's just, and you cook, and then some restaurants will like naturally cook with it, and it'll be on like a burger. And there's so many things you're like, can I get this without onions? Just tell me the candidate that says I'm banning this from. The whole. It's a banned. If
any
substance.
Of our major candidates happen to be formed listeners, you now know how to get Isaac's
onions
vote.
A banned substance.
That's what you want. That is what you want in life. Okay.
I will vote for you.
Unbelievable.
All right. Sorry.
Did you think of one, Barry?
You know, I haven't come up with a good one yet. Although you mentioned yours. I like yours. I think I could get behind this.
You could get behind
You and
mine?
I could support the same.
All right.
Yeah, we could maybe start a whole political party behind this.
This is fair, right? So ours is that if you're driving, you cannot drive slow in the left lane. You should not be, if that is you, and I'm sorry if that's one of our forum listeners, if you're one of those people that's driving slow in the left lane, you should go to jail.
Go to jail.
Yep.
Go to jail.
That's it.
Overnight in jail.
No grace.
It's not a ticket. It's we're
jail.
Taking you in.
You go under the speed limit.
Yep.
You are going straight behind bars.
Yeah. I mean, in some countries, like there would be like corporal punishment for that. So,
Barry, you don't have anything?
I couldn't come up with something. I'm sure as soon as you say, see you next week, I'm sure there'll be something that pops into my head. So I'll bring it back next week if I come up with it.
You don't want to make like Dallas Willard required reading?
No, I don't want everybody to know about Dallas Willard.
Yeah. So. He doesn't want that, but
insider.
All right. Well, Barry's going to think about one in like 3 minutes. Yeah. So, we
managed to get Dallas Willard and Peeps and Candy Corn into one episode. Yeah.
All right, guys. We'll be back next week for the next week in our series. Let's talk about it, and make sure you follow along in our Sunday morning messages at the same time. Peace out.